Greetings, fellow readers. This is Rambling Collector here, and welcome to another episode of Let's Read. For the subject of this video, I figured we would do a bit of a vampiric twist this time. So we're going to be doing the vampire werewolf novel, Beyond the Veil, by Jessica Majzner. This one I actually thoroughly enjoyed for quite a few reasons. Not just because vampires, but mostly for werewolves. Because again, werewolves themselves are not represented as much in fiction, or if they are, they're kind of cast to the side over vampires, which is why I thoroughly enjoyed this novel in particular, due to werewolves getting more of a spotlight. So for the subject of this video, I'm going to read both the prologue and chapter 1 of this book, since they're both relatively short, and I figured it'd make for a nice longer video length at the very least. And if you're curious after the video is over to check out the book for yourself to learn more, I will leave a link to where you can buy it on Amazon down below in the description. With that being said, let's get started with the prologue. Prologue. Destiny Unfolding. Anessa had never before been mistaken about anyone's identity, and so it would be with the girl that now entered her shop. Numerous chimes sounded as Natalia walked in, trailing morosely behind her father. Anessa laid a weathered hand onto the book she had been skimming through to mark her page and peered over the desk at her customers. The man was handsome with pleasantly arranged features, but Anessa only gave him a cursory glance before studying his daughter. She could not have been older than 12 years, for her face had not yet lost the gaiety of youth. Her eyes, though, were too wise and too lined, and they seemed to hint at some tragic event that seemed to have already aged her. She walked without intent or purpose, merely following her father, though he too seemed to have drifted in nearly by accident. The two of them wandered through the store, her father stopping every once in a while to leaf through a book or remark on a handmade dream catcher, but the girl only nodded blankly. She passed by armored dress forms, bows, spears, healing crystals, and other oddities, but nothing seemed to garner her attention until she drifted to the front counter. Here the girl's eyes finally lit up with interest, and Anessa smiled down at her kindly. Like a moth helplessly drawn to light, she had become entranced with the crystal ball that decorated Anessa's counter. The old woman nodded approvingly as the girl studied the swirling depths, though she could discern nothing from them. "Would you like your fortune read, dear?" Anessa asked kindly, though the girl jumped slightly. Her father had heard, and he too approached the counter after returning the crystal he had been holding to its proper place. He nodded encouragingly at his daughter and answered for her. "Natalia will be honored, Anessa," he said with feeling, and the old fortune-teller knew that he meant it. In her many years she had gained much respect from her people, and most considered it a great blessing for her to predict their futures. Even the foreigners, of which she had seen many of in the last few weeks, had known of her, and those that had allowed her to read their fortunes would later find her talents to be unfailing in their accuracy. She did not know what brought these two to her unassuming antique shop during this trading season, but she had a feeling that fate itself had something to do with it. "Thank you," she said. "It has been many years, but the stars have foretold our meeting again. Not many still seek out my shop, not since the vampires and werewolves have been banished from Valwood." At these words the girl's eyes widened in fear, and Anessa felt a strange compassion stirring within her. She led her away from her father to an unmarked back room where yet another crystal ball lay waiting in its center, and Anessa settled herself behind it. The silver glow from the ball cast shadows on Anessa's face, deepening her wrinkles and making her appear even older. "Don't be afraid," she whispered, and the girl nodded. The cloudy contents of the ball began to swirl even faster, and darkened in color. For a few moments they sat in awed silence, though the girl could not see what Anessa could. A seam was forming in the indistinct mist, and Anessa narrowed her eyes, struggling to take it all in. "I see much in your future, child," she said after a short while. "A future with much power and strength in it." And the girl smiled, though her expression knew no understanding. "Though not all of it is good," Anessa continued, and the girl's face fell. "I see much sadness and much loss as well, for you are marked." "What do you mean?" "You are the next vampire huntress, and so destined to bring their kind to an end from this place. Your destiny has already cost you your mother at a young age, but I know you are meant to avenge her death." The blank and unknowing facade that the girl seemed to be fronting had finally shattered. "How are you sure that it's me?" she asked, and Anessa smiled. It was the smile that a magician gives a prying child when asked his secret. "Wait here," she murmured, and disappeared through the door. A moment later, Anessa returned with a small box that was wider than it was tall, and held it out to her. "Open it," the fortune-teller encouraged. The girl did so, and gasped in wonder. Inside was a pendant unlike anything she had ever seen, a precious onyx gemstone in the shape of a perfect teardrop that hung from a delicate chain. When she inspected it more closely, she realized that the black stone did not seem to be solid. It shifted and writhed within its casing, almost like the crystal ball before her. "It's beautiful," the girl managed to whisper. Anessa delicately lifted it from its box as the girl held her hair. She clasped it around her neck. Almost instantly the color changed to a pure amethyst, and her face was caught in its purple glow. "Only the next huntress could make it turn that color," Anessa explained, and the girl went to take it off. Anessa motioned for her to stop. "It's yours." "I can't, Anessa. It will help aid you. Your family's blood is especially potent, and this is reflected in the present color of the necklace. This amulet will allow you some protection, as any vampire that tries to touch you will find that he cannot. The power of your blood will be amplified through the stone. It will change color subtly with your mood, and it will also burn warmly against your skin, warning you of impending danger. It is the one thing I can give," she said. "Thank you," said the girl simply, taking the amulet carefully in her hands. Her face showed no doubt now. "It suits you beautifully," Anessa said. "Now listen to me, child. You have a great path before you, but it cannot be done alone. You shall succeed only if you are willing to trust those who have not been trusted." "What do you mean?" The woman smiled, almost sadly. "This you must learn on your own, dear. There are many paths to victory. You must walk the finest line between our two worlds and not be corrupted yourself. And there is more, child, about your mother." The girl lowered her head, her hands resting in her lap. She hadn't known much about her, only that she had been killed when she was very young. "It is your destiny to defeat the vampire that killed her, Arcadith. But you must be careful. He is ancient, and vampires have long memories, almost as long as their immortal lives. They do not forget easily, and forgive even less easily. Your identity will have to remain a secret in order to protect your loved ones. He will not be easily defeated, and he will use anyone near you in order to get at you." Natalia's eyes flicked towards the door where her father waited in the other room, and she shivered. "Even he cannot know about you," Anessa said sternly. "Arcadith will target him if he can, and we cannot take any chances. If he knows too much, I fear for us all. But I have faith in you. I believe you have the power within you to succeed where others have not. Avenge her," Anessa whispered, and the girl nodded gravely. Natalia slid the amulet beneath her blouse where it lay hidden from view, and it dimmed in response. She returned to her father, and he placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her out of the shop. Anessa watched them go. The girl who was ready to confront her destiny, and the old woman knew that fate had chosen well. Chapter 1. The Death of a Legend. 5 years later. The fabled castle was near. Anessa could see where it stood, silhouetted high up on a mountain crag on a winding staircase of crumbling stone. It lay in the heart of the great forests of Valwood, shrouded in mystery and a long-lost symbol of man's journey into the peaks. She was still miles away from it, but all the surrounding trees stood in the mountain's shadow. She knew that the foreboding citadel was adorned with gargoyles and turrets that seemed to disappear into the rising mist and reappear with the patterns of the weather. A fence, black wrought iron, encircled the castle, rising and falling with the contours of the land and hidden in places by looming pines. She was not near enough to see these details, but she could envision them clearly, even though she had never once traversed the great steps into its stony walls. She knew because it was her destiny to know, and to pass all she knew to the next vampire huntress. Anessa thrust her walking stick into the ground and leaned heavily against it. She rested a moment, her breathing slightly ragged in the late summer breeze. With the onset of old age, her strength and stamina had been diminished, but her mind, it seemed, only grew sharper in defiance. The woods were beautiful, and she could not help but notice the way the sun cast brightly colored rays through the gaps in the trees, outlining the green foliage in glowing amber. She pressed onwards. She did not need to rely on the walking stick as heavily as she had before her brief respite, and gradually her breathing slowed to a normal rate. The sun began to die, and dusk fell. She was making good time. Anessa felt a gradual warming at her neck. The dark forest was saturated in topaz as the amulet she wore brightened, illuminating the trees with its yellowish light. She slowed again, this time not out of weariness but out of instinct, born of the deer that knows a wolf pack is trailing her scent. The vampire she had been tracking was near. Her ears strained in their quest to dissect every call of the bird or drone of an instinct for some more sinister source. Her icy blue eyes shifted to each side, scanning each rock, tree, and bush for movement. She did not feel fear, but her heart beat quicker in anticipation. Anessa heard him before she saw him, but as the snapping of twigs grew louder and a subtle hissing like a many-headed viper seemed to fill the air, she realized she had walked into an ambush. The vampires were closing in, and by the sounds of it, there were at least 4 of them. The elderly woman withdrew the stake that had been strapped to her thigh beneath her clothing, abandoning the walking stick. 5 vampires approached at every angle. She could not possibly face them all, but she circled anyway, not wishing to show any of the creatures her back. Their mental nudges to drop her stake or forfeit the amulet were easily pushed aside, and she used almost no energy in defying their efforts to seduce her mind. At the signal of whom Anessa presumed to be the leader, a sibilation that was strangled with thirst, the vampires attacked simultaneously. Anessa responded with reflexes honed by years of training and enhanced by the magic of her amulet, wielding her stake like a sword and plunging it into the unfortunate heart of the first fledgling that had raised his fangs to her. Fledglings they must have been, for they lacked respect for the huntress and fear of her pendant and weapons. She had dispatched 2 already when the third made a desperate reach for her throat. With his canines extended, the newly turned vampire's hand closed over her amulet in a bid to clear his way towards the vein in her neck. The chain snapped under his grasp, and a moment later he hurled it into the trees where its light was lost in shadow. Anessa heard his gut-wrenching scream as contact with the amulet had scorched his hand black. As he watched in horror, the blackness traveled up his arm where it came to rest as the poison settled. Not even his regenerative abilities could heal this terrible wound, and he held his useless arm to his breast, doubled up in reduced gasp that racked his stricken body. Prolonged contact with the amulet would have killed him, but Anessa's stake found his heart instead. After the third vampire lay dead, Anessa turned to the other 2, but with less confidence as she had before. She seemed to age before them. The lines etched in her face deepened, and her eyes sank into recesses beneath her brows. Her hair thinned, her movements slowed, and she stooped slightly as the power of her amulet left her body. The vampires quickened in their pursuit, knowing that she was vulnerable now. With no time to search the woods for her amulet, she raised her stake. She was not at a complete disadvantage. Many years of experience with the stake had hardened her muscles under loosening skin, and her extensive knowledge of the vampire's weakness, their ravenous thirst, made her quite the dangerous prey even without her amulet. But even she could not take on 2 vampires without the protection of the poisonous magic. For several moments she managed to hold them off, and they loathed to get too near of her deadly stake. But as one of them closed his hold around her slender neck, and the other had sunk his fangs into her arm, the strength left her dominant hand. Her grip relaxed on the stake, and it fell to the ground, never again to bury itself in a vampire's chest. But Anessa never carried just 1 stake. She ripped another that was concealed at her left thigh from its holdings, and forced it into the neck of the vampire at her throat. Her attack gave her just enough time to rip it from his spurting wound and gain the leverage needed to thrust it into his heart. With an agonizing howl, the 4th vampire died. Her own neck was bleeding. A trickle fell from where the vampire's teeth had made contact with her skin. Likewise, her mangled right arm was crimson with a gushing torrent. Her spilled blood was a catalyst to the 5th vampire's thirst, and he tore at Anessa's flesh in his quest to soothe the burning in his throat. Her worn skin broke easily, and he wasted no time in plunging his own fangs into her neck once again. Incensed, his desperate feeding had become a frenzy, and Anessa felt herself falling, in slow motion it seemed, to the dirt and fallen leaves. She felt her blood, her very life force cascading from her body, and as her head collided painfully against the ground, she closed her eyes. The feeding of the vampire seemed like a distant dream, and she felt her consciousness separating from her ravaged body. She could remember it so vividly, the memory she now found herself within the throes of. The ending of spring long after the snows had melted away. She and Natalia were cresting a hill, far within the limits of their own border, though secluded enough to not be disturbed. The uphill climb had been strenuous, and she pretended not to notice Natalia's concerned frown, as she paused again to catch her breath. They had reached the top of the hill, and Natalia flopped down onto the grass, savoring one of the last pleasantly cool days before the summer heat would set in. Something was bothering the girl. She was absent-mindedly plucking the blades and gathering them into her hands. She lifted the green fronds to the skies and scattered them to the winds, watching as they were gently carried to the earth again. After a while, Natalia broke the silence with the question Anessa knew had burned in her for too long. "Anessa, why me? Why am I the next vampire huntress?" The old woman chuckled slightly and thought for a while before speaking. "Irina asked me the very same question many years ago," Anessa murmured thoughtfully. "You are both so much the same," she continued. "Always learning and questioning, and neither of you willing to simply accept things as they come." The girl was waiting patiently for her to continue, though her fingers betrayed her eagerness by continuing to ceaselessly pull at the grass. Anessa smiled warmly, and she drew a long breath as she thought of the easiest way to explain. "I knew from the moment I met you that you were destined to hunt vampires, just like your mother, though you possess neither special abilities nor unique prowess over any other of humankind. And when your father was christened an elder of Valwood, it became even more evident to me that you were fated for something great. Our destinies are not laid out before us when we are born, for we are all given the power to choose what life we lead for ourselves." "I didn't choose this," Natalia muttered. She looked away, and a tiny part of Anessa's heart broke. "But you have, dear. From the time Irina was killed, you chose to avenge her. It is that which has brought you to this end. Our people have always opposed the vampires, but very few have what it takes to drive them from Valwood for good." Natalia gazed up at her mentor, and Anessa felt almost a motherly concern for the 14-year-old girl before her. The feeling was mutual, though neither could bring themselves to say it, and they merely sat in the grass, enjoying each other's company. Slowly, Anessa's eyes opened as the memory dissolved. She was faint and confused, but Natalia would be along soon, and she knew that everything would be all right then. She was not too far behind her, after all. She smiled fondly. She did not have much time left, but as she tried to bring the mountain where she knew Arcadia's castle lay into view, she could only see the treetops looming into the starry sky. She was lost in her delirium, unsure of which reality she resided in, this distant memory or the stifling blackness. And as her vision swam and the last of her blood had finally escaped her flagging body, she died with the knowledge that she would be succeeded by a girl whose power would someday come to surpass even her own. Natalia knew that the vampire could still sense her. He heard every beat of her horse's hooves, every nicker that sounded from her mare's mouth. Each breath that she took and every command she uttered to the mare acted as a beacon to her location with his superior hearing. He could smell them, too. The earthy scent that unfurled from her skin, and the sweat that was beginning to gather on her brow. All allowed him to pinpoint the position she held in her perch. She was like a spider lying in wait for its prey, and so they were both aware of the other. But he could not see her. Not yet. High above the ground, Natalia was leaning into the crook of a tree, her handsome grey mare, Mathia, grazing contentedly below her. She scanned the landscape around her, keenly searching for any sign of the vampire. The view was breathtaking, but hindered by its unfamiliarity. In her 17 years, Natalia had never before ventured this far into the forest. The woods, rich and lush with green life, lay before her in every direction, nestled under the distant peaks that marked the border of Valwood. Despite the nearly endless sea of trees, she trusted her instincts to guide her, and would not easily become lost. Nimbly, Natalia climbed down to the lowest branch and jumped the remaining way to the ground. Her hunt was coming to an end, and she smiled in satisfaction. She untied her horse and mounted her, kicking her into a run. The mare was beautiful and lean, with a finely shaped head and ringlets of differently shaded greys that faded into black at her knees. Above her, an owl soared above the treetops. Its white face glowed in the darkness as it flew almost in slow motion, though still keeping up with her easily in flight and not allowing a somber note to escape its beak. Its penetrating glare picked through the brush with ease. Mice scurried through the dirt, and rabbits chewed absent-mindedly at the grass with their ears perked for any noise. But still the owl flew on. Its coal-black eyes were only interested in the girl, and it followed her with intense purpose as she and the horse swerved between the trees and sailed easily over boulders and fallen logs. The two continued on at their pace for a quarter of an hour before they began to slow and the owl pulled up, hovering in the air. It watched as Natalia pulled the horse to a stop, and it swooped, deadly quiet now in its pursuit. It splayed its talons outwards and perched on the low-hanging branch of a nearby tree. The owl turned deliberately in its roost to face Natalia, cocking its head slightly as she dismounted from Mathia. The bird waited, diligent in its vigil, keenly attentive to her every move. Occasionally it turned to preen its feathers or listen to the far-off movements of a distant squirrel, but it did not abandon its post. Its gaze was compellingly eerie, the eyes like twin pools of unfathomable depth and impossible understanding. But Natalia never saw. The bird blended with the landscape, as unremarkable to her as the bark of one of the many deciduous trees. She knew the vampire had not lost track of her movements. He paused, and Natalia froze. All of her senses flared to keep him within reach. They were in perfect balance with each other. The predator moved as the prey moved, and he was hunting her just as much as she was hunting him. She weighed her chances. He had sizable fangs and unnaturally sharp nails that lengthened into claws. He also had superior strength and speed. She had her horse, reckless daring with matching cunning, the stake, and the mysterious amulet that hung from her neck. She also had the bow, but with its silver-tipped arrows it was of more use against werewolves than vampires. Made of finely polished wood that curved into a graceful arc, it was a beautiful weapon, though Natalia found its deadliness most attractive. The two were evenly matched. The seconds slipped into minutes as they each waited for the other to make a move. The vampire acted first. Without warning, he began to run. He was smoothly cutting a path through the woods, so fast it was only a mere moment before Natalia lost sight of him. She returned to her horse and pulled herself into the saddle again as the gap between them began to close. She urged the mare into a frenzied gallop, inwardly relishing the challenge of the hunt. Back at the tree, the owl took flight again after her. Swiftly they ran, froth running from her horse's lips at the bit, and still Natalia pushed her to run faster. Fallen leaves and dust flew into the air after her pounding hooves as the trees flew by, but the vampire continued to elude her. It was another hour before they had caught up to their quarry. He had finally stopped running and was kneeling on the ground, his back to Natalia. She pulled sharply on the reins and her horse began to slow, sweat glistening on the mare's chest and legs. Her nostrils flared and she was breathing heavily. As quietly as she could, Natalia followed the vampire, anxious to know why he had suddenly stopped. She snapped on the horse's reins, but Mathia did not move. The mare had stopped, snorting anxiously and refusing to go any further. Natalia tried coaxing the horse into a trot, but she knew the smell of blood was in the mare's nostrils, and it was only by leading the horse on foot that Natalia was able to make any more progress. When she had neared the vampire, Natalia secured Mathia to a nearby tree and unsheathed her stake. She could hear gut-wrenching noises from the hunched-over vampire, and she crept closer. It was clear the vampire was feeding, though it was impossible to tell how long the victim had been dead. Natalia swallowed the bile that rose in her throat, silently willing herself to not be sick. The smell of blood was also heavy in the air, concealing Natalia's scent. She knew his thoughts were consumed with quenching his insatiable thirst, and of nothing else, and so she was able to get quite close behind him. She raised her stake above her head, preparing to drive it through his heart. Instead, she gasped, nearly dropping the weapon in shock as she saw the weathered face of the dead victim. "No!" she moaned aloud, before she could stop herself, and the vampire, alerted to her presence, rolled around with inhuman speed. The victim was Anessa. Her age and slowing reflexes had finally failed her after all of these years. Blinded with grief, Natalia lunged with her stake, but the vampire had already fled with blood still dripping from his fangs. Natalia merely watched him go, with tears coursing down her cheeks, unable to summon the will to follow him. "No, not her," the mantra repeated in her head until the words had lost all meaning. The body was already showing signs of decay and had been partially drained of blood, but Natalia couldn't be mistaken. She studied the woman's face, from the innumerable lines that weathered it to her wispy white hair. Her neck was absent of her amulet, and it was clear that she had fought without its protection. What had befallen the woman that she had been forced to remove it? Anessa's lips were parted slightly as if she had still been speaking, longing still to impart her knowledge to Natalia, even after her death. Natalia tried to imagine her final moments, but she couldn't reconcile the raw, uninhibited strength her former mentor had so easily demonstrated with the frail, defeated woman beside her. One of her triumphs lay next to her, though. the bloodied and broken body of one of the vampires. Anessa's stake was protruding from his chest. Natalia wrenched it from the body, ignoring the sickening crunch of his collapsed chest as she slid it from between his broken ribs. How many others had she faced, and how many others had this stake felled? In her prime, the woman had been a formidable force, and Natalia knew bitterly that all life must someday yield to the failings of age. She circled her mentor, searching for clues to her demise. It was clear she had been dead for at least a few hours, and it was likely the vampire had returned to this place many times in the night to replenish the fading strength that the chase had taken. Her rounds in the surrounding woods revealed 3 more dead vampires, in varying degree of injury and decomposition. One thing had struck Natalia as strange, though. Anessa's body did not exhibit the classic 2-pronged bite to the neck, as most vampire attacks did. Instead, her body had been unnecessarily mangled and precious blood allowed to flow into the earth from multiple wounds. Natalia looked at the surrounding scene, though her suspicion that this had been a newly created vampire had begun to grow. Many footprints that pointed in erratic directions filled the scene, hinting at a struggle, and as Natalia counted the sets of prints, she realized she and Anessa had walked straight into a trap. She returned to Anessa's body and began rummaging through her pack, searching for the thing she had picked up a few days earlier on a whim. At last her fingers closed on what she had been looking for, careful to avoid the thorns. She pulled out a single red rose that had been perfectly preserved by one of Valwood's shopkeepers and arranged it carefully, closing Anessa's hand over it. The woman instantly seemed more serene, though the ruse still could not hide the old woman's blood. It was the closest thing to a decent burial Natalia could provide now, though she knew it wouldn't be long until someone else discovered her and a proper funeral would be held. The vampire she left to the coming sunlight that would render his and the other bodies to dust. "I'm sorry I couldn't do more for you," Natalia murmured aloud. As she had leaned over the woman, her amulet swung downwards, nearly touching Anessa's body. The fog shifted and began to swirl very fast until it faded into a cloudy gray. Natalia grasped the pendant in her hand, for it seemed as if it too were mourning the woman's death. She entwined her hand with the dead woman's in parting before standing up once more. She began to shake as pure rage began flowing through her veins. The adrenaline lent strength to her body, fueling her desire to avenge the woman. She knew the time for grief would come, but now was not that time. Her only thought was to avenge Anessa's death. With cold-blooded focus, she untied Methia and studied the prints the fleeing vampire had left behind. Her eyes widened in surprise as she connected his footprints to his destination in her mind. It couldn't be. Confusion forced itself through her sadness. He seemed to be heading straight towards the ruins, the territory of the werewolves. It made no sense for the vampire to seek out his bitterest enemies, though the footprints were clearly traveling in that direction. Natalia shook her head and looked at the woman sadly for the last time. Now that Anessa was gone, she remained the only person in Valwood capable of defending her people from the ever-present threats of the vampires. Their numbers were thriving with the abundance of human blood her city provided them, and Natalia was determined to break the cycle. "I promise I won't sleep soundly until the last vampire dies," she vowed to her fallen mentor with a shaking voice. She sheathed her weapon, mounted her horse, and continued towards Claw Haven. No matter how many vampires her mentor had faced, Natalia would kill them all and avenge Anessa. As the night deepened and Natalia followed the fleeing prince of the vampire, she allowed the rhythmic gait of the cantering horse to soothe her terrible thoughts. She rode, numb and nearly unfeeling to the trail's end, until she could see a looming gray wall before her. The fabled wall that had divided the citizens of Valwood from the territory of the werewolves for over 100 years. And that was Chapter 1. Like I said, you guys, if you want to check out this book for yourself and read more of it, if you're curious, I will leave a link to the Amazon store where you can find it for yourself in the description down below. And most of all, you guys, I hope you enjoyed this new book reading, and I will see you all again for the next episode. I hope you're as excited about it as I am, and believe me, you might be in for a surprise. And if you like this video, feel free to leave a like, comment your thoughts down below, or subscribe if you're interested for more. Once again, thank you all for sticking with me for this video, and I'll see you all in the next Let's Read. Have a great day, fellow readers. This is Rambling Collector, signing off for now.